Hey there, everybody. So, we are looking at Chapter 7, Politics and Society in the New Republic. And so, in this section, we're going to look at building new government, our new government, the United States, the Federalists versus the Republicans. We'll look at Thomas Jefferson, his agrarian vision of America, the real beginnings of westward expansion, and we may or may not cover the War of 1812. We'll see. We will see. So we cover here, in essence, this is what's known as, historically, it's known as the early Republican period. This has nothing to do with politics, or okay, that would be the wrong way to put it. This has nothing to do with political party. There's nothing to do with Republican or Democrat, anything like that. Just it's the idea that America is a republic. The idea that it's a republic which has protections for the liberties of its citizens. And also, the republic is a government that should represent the actual needs of the citizenry. It's a representative, sort of a representative democracy, sort of. And so we'll cover this early Republican period here in some detail. So George Washington received the highest number of votes. He was elected president in 1788. The Federalists, this would be what we call the Federalist Party. He was the leader of the Federalist Party, or the Federalist faction, would have been maybe the word they used at the time. They pretty much took all the seats in Congress. So generally speaking, the Federalists controlled the government the first 4 years. They actually control the government, for the most part, the first 12 years. Washington serves 8, and then John Adams, our second president, serves 4. So all the way through the rest of the 1700s, we have Federalists generally in charge in Congress and at the White House. Yeah, we have a White House now, at least the first White House. John Adams was elected as vice president as well. Washington is interesting. There's not a lot of real guidance in the Constitution. It's pretty vague, pretty limited on the executive branch, the president. Washington made some interesting choices that became very important down the line. He insists that he only had the right to appoint government officials and to remove government officials that were not doing their jobs, according to him anyway. These are not necessarily elected positions. These are appointed positions. He's the one who really starts this. He simply believes he has the right to choose people in government. Congress is separate. Congress is elected. But as far as most of the rest of the positions in Washington, he believes he has the right to appoint them, as well as remove them from those positions. Today, it's one of the most significant powers of the president, the power of appointment. Currently, presidents can appoint about 4,000 positions in Washington. Simply handpick. Some of these have to be approved by Congress, some do not. This is one of the more significant powers of the president that is used on a regular, everyday basis, this power of appointment and removing people from appointments. And Washington, this isn't in the Constitution, Washington just sort of comes up with this and believes it should be his position to do this. It gives him some sort of supremacy among the three branches. At the time, the third branch, the judicial branch, the Supreme Court, was very weak. Very limited power. And it was thought the most powerful branch would be the legislative, the Congress. Hard to know for sure. The first cabinet was Thomas Jefferson as Secretary of State, who deals with foreign affairs. Alexander Hamilton as Secretary of Treasury, the taxes and commerce. And then Henry Knox, Secretary of War. Who was in charge of our defense. Also, he created the Supreme Court, was there too, which the Supreme Court also today is very powerful, but it was not really envisioned. Really, the Constitution puts most of the power in the hands of Congress. However, over time, that has diminished to where the executive and the judicial both have a lot more power than was probably originally envisioned. Excuse me. The Bill of Rights was added as promised. I mentioned in the last chapter, the Bill of Rights was promised when they began the ratification process. It was added officially. 1791, we get the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. Originally, they thought there might have been as many as 17 or 18. Everyone's familiar with what the amendments give. The Bill of Rights, freedom of press, freedom of speech, um, freedom of religion, freedom to bear arms, and the right to due process in court. You can't be forced to quarter troops in your homes. Pretty much the entire Bill of Rights, almost all of it, was really focused on all the oppressive tactics that England used on America leading up to the Revolution. And then the 10th Amendment is one of the most significant. It's one a lot of people don't talk about, but you'd have to understand, if it weren't for the 10th Amendment, our entire country would be different today, incredibly different. The 10th Amendment simply says any power not directly given to the government, the federal government, is reserved to the states. I'm paraphrasing. That's huge, because that means anything that isn't spelled out in the Constitution should actually be reserved to the states. It gives a lot of power that would be assumed federal. It gives a lot of power back to the states, which has really shaped the way our entire political system in the country has developed. This thing that you'll hear me mention many times over the next few chapters, the state versus federal rights. Talk about it a lot in American history moving forward. State versus federal rights. Big debates over that. Washington was sort of seen as he was always a war hero. He was seen as a war hero. But some of these images are sort of reminiscent of, what do you think? What do you think this says about Washington? The way you've got all the men looking up to him. He's held higher than all the rest. You have all these proud men next to him. He's at the top of everything. The statues on the sides, the columns with the capitals on the top, what do those indicate? The statues up here. Think about what that really seems to bring to mind from ancient culture. And this one especially. Who used to, in ancient times, the hint, Romans, would have their conquering emperors come back, and they'd walk under arches, and women would throw flowers at their feet, and the virgins would stand out there and offer themselves to the emperors. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying Washington saw this of himself, but many people saw him of it. Many people saw him as his ways. He was treated in many ways like a monarch, because you must understand, in this time period, that's what everybody understood. They didn't understand a president exactly. Matter of fact, even John Adams suggested Washington's title should be His Majesty the President. So people didn't really have a conception of what a non-monarchical, if that's the right word, ruler would even be. A non-divine, because monarchs are seen as semi-divine kings, and that is what everyone understood at this time period, because pretty much all European countries had kings. So this idea of having a government without a king, we don't really understand how revolutionary this was. I'm not going to say we're the first, I can't say it for sure, but we were one of the very first governments in the Western world, certainly, to have a government without a king. It was really strange. So many people sort of treated him as a king and sort of saw him as a king because it's the only thing they could relate it to. It doesn't seem like Washington saw it that way necessarily. But it's interesting. Think about how all the imagery means and why people thought of this and what they would be doing. How easy it would have been for him to almost assume the kingship position. All right. Well, Washington is president for 8 years. John Adams takes over. He wins election in '96, close election. I think he runs against Jefferson. There are probably others, but he's really close election there. Very split. Lots of splits in the '90s over the vision of America, where we should go. Lots of splits between Alexander Hamilton's plans, what Jefferson wanted, what John Adams wanted. What it means is, when we started out, just in '88, just a few years earlier, we had really one faction. It was just Federalists. It wasn't even a faction at that point, if you want to call it that way. It's just one group. Within just the first 5 years, we already have a split. Even though our founding fathers didn't believe factionalism was good for the government, and it's not. We know this today the term we might use today is partisanship. We know partisanship is terrible for the country. It is. Partisanship only serves half the people. It doesn't serve the other half. It's just terrible partisanship. Yet that is what our government is, incredibly partisan. Um, they believe partisanship was wrong, or what they would call factionalism is wrong. Well, it happens almost immediately. Factionalism begins right from the start. It really is Jefferson that really splits off. Jefferson believes the way the Federalists want to run, especially the Treasury, the way they want to do the Treasury in economics. Alexander Hamilton has some plans about creating national debt, and he wants to do this on purpose because if you create national debt, well, it's how you get a credit score, folks. And you know that, right? The only way you get a good credit score is if you have debt. You have to have debt and then pay it off, on time. That's how you get a good credit score. The more debt you have that you then pay off, the better your score is, because it shows that you're a good risk. You have a lot of debt and you pay it off. You're a good risk. They know that. So he said that's what we should do. We're a brand new country. We don't really have a good credit score with anybody. We want other countries to trade with us and have deals with us. So the best thing we need to do is take on a bunch of debt and then pay it off. And Jefferson, of course, thinks it's crazy because it just doesn't seem to make sense to him, and it's more complicated. But that's basically one of the things. And then, of course, this debt thing also really entails the beginnings of industrialization and factories. We enter into an industrial revolution here, our first industrial revolution, and that is also an interesting thing. It really is. He doesn't believe that's a good thing either. Jefferson doesn't believe in this industrialization. Jefferson believes we should be a nation of farmers, what we would call his agrarian vision. It's a farmer rural lifestyle with an economy based on agrarian and agricultural goods, farming goods, stuff like that. So, really, this whole thing over Hamilton is what really creates our first factions. And Jefferson gladly goes off on his own. And by the mid 90s, we have our own new political party. We're a new political faction. Jefferson's what are called Democratic Republicans. That's what he calls himself, Democratic Republicans. Pretty much represents Southern planters, that aka slave owners. Although not, don't get me wrong, there's others who aren't slave owners, but that's Southern planters. The ones who have the power and money are the slave owners. And then all sort of the Western free farmers, Western white farmers. And Jefferson believes we have to make a choice. We have to either choose to be factory workers, wage laborers, or we have to be independent middle-class farmers, what we'll call yeoman farmers, these independent middle-class farmers. And he says this is the future of America, not this. Well, Jefferson was wrong. Obviously, this is what America became. Although it should be noted over the next generations, the next 20, 30 years, Jefferson's vision of agrarianism actually pans out quite well. It does well in the next generation. It really does. But, in the long term, of course, he was wrong. But in the short term, he was generally right. It really was. He really argued it couldn't sustain us. Trying to worry about money and debt and trying to worry about banking and we ended up creating like a national bank and all this kind of stuff. He says is not really useful. We just need to get out there, get our hands dirty, grow crops, and sell them, and really work on international trade, selling all of our farm products. And we're going to make money. We're going to grow. We're going to expand, and we're going to make money. And it turns out he's right about that. Don't get me wrong. There are factories in the north. There's people in the cities. I mean, at this point in time, New York has got already hundreds of thousands of people. So, there's lots of people in the cities, although still the majority of people do live rural lifestyles. But turns out Jefferson was really right in the short term, because what happens with Europe? What happens in the 90s with Europe? Anybody? The Revolution! Viva la Revolution! Yeah, it's the French Revolution. The French Revolution occurs in the 80s, 90s, and leads to, of course, the creation of, the greatest dictator, conqueror of this generation, Napoleon Bonaparte. So the French Revolution happens, which causes massive devastation and destruction across Europe. The French Revolution spreads outside the borders of France quickly. And the French Revolution, of course, creates Napoleon, who becomes a conqueror, and he actually becomes an emperor over Europe, where he calls himself an emperor. And he does conquer Europe. For several years, he wages a world war on Europe, and he wins. At one point, by the early 1800s, he's conquered the entire continent, really. until they all basically get pissed off and rebel against him. And then he falls fast. Well, war is fought in farmlands. War is fought in fields. War is fought where there's farmhouses and where all the peasants live. And Europe is still primarily peasants and serfs. So the revolution in France, which was a very large population, and then Napoleon's wars in Europe in the early 1800s create mass starvation and mass food shortages. Who comes to the rescue? We do. We end up doubling and tripling our farm acreage. We end up doubling and tripling our exports. This becomes the major source of economic revenue for the U.S. for several years. Agricultural exports to Europe to basically feed all the starving people and clothe all the freezing people. So it really makes it appear as though Jefferson's agrarian vision is genius. It was just genius. And this is really the future of America for the next generation or two, is really its agricultural agrarian vision. Very interesting how it worked out well. It's very successful for him and his party, his group, because his group, Jefferson and the people who think like Jefferson, pretty much run our government for the next 20-some years, as we'll talk about, 20 plus years. Really his version of very more agrarian agricultural focus. Works well. So again, we didn't really think political parties were good. This political factionalism wasn't really good because it's like, I like to use the sports analogy. If you're playing a football game and you win, you win. But what's that mean happened to the other side? They lost. That is really what political parties are. It's competition. It's sporting. If we win, they lose. If they win, we lose. Is there any situation where both sides win? No. You don't have ties in politics, even though you can have that in sports. But the idea is it doesn't serve the public interest. It doesn't serve the public interest because if you just take the analogy to its most simple, half the time you get what you want and they don't get what they want. And then it's the other way around. So every single situation, every single election, half the people get screwed. How fair is that? Because our politicians are not supposed to represent 50% of the people, are they? Our politicians in Congress are supposed to represent what percentage of the people? 100%. They're supposed to represent everybody. So this political factionalism they just thought was wrong, because it creates this atmosphere of competition and this atmosphere of we win and you lose. And it just, we're all in this together. It's all the same country. So we should all win, not only just half of us or just the rich or the upper class. So it's not really in the public interest. Yet it happens right from the beginning. And we've never looked back. It's only got worse, this partisanship. It's terrible. So lots of debate over Hamilton's policies and Jefferson's policies, and we see this election really come. We have really two political parties this election. The Democratic Republicans of Jefferson versus Adams and his Federalists. Adams wins, really close. It's almost a tie election. Both these two elections, 96 and 1800, both of them are almost ties. They're almost a dead tie, and I think both times it's Adams and Jefferson. Adams wins 96, Jefferson wins in 1800. Democratic Republicans are mostly prominent in the southern states, and the Federalists are mostly prominent in the northern states. Federalists are mostly prominent in the cities, and Democratic Republicans are more prominent in the rural areas. It's a pretty even split. Even though the cities take up a much smaller area, and the rural areas are much, much bigger, 100 times bigger than the cities, the rural areas, of course, are sparsely populated. So it's a pretty even split in population between cities and rural areas. There's public festivals and celebrations and parties, and right from the very beginning, it's got a sporting atmosphere. This idea of we're going to win, we're going to go to victory. That's the thing. If we win, the other people's got to lose, and that isn't right. Politics needs to be representing everybody, not just half the people. It's interesting. Lots of celebrations and parties right from the very beginning. John Adams, John Adams was elected president over Thomas Jefferson. It's a very close victory. He wins. So he gets 4 years. He only gets 4 years. I'm not going to talk much about him. He was not a good president. He's considered to have been very, very fault. He just wasn't considered to be a good president. He was too arrogant, too contemptuous of others, too intellectual. I mean, he was smarter than everybody else. And he really was. The guy was really smart. His contemporaries called him a genius. That was his problem. Probably he was too much in his head. He wasn't really a people person. Most people didn't like him. One on one, Adams was just not a nice person. People just didn't like him, really. You should read the letters from his wife. You can find those online. His wife regularly criticizes him. His wife. I mean, she loved him, but she was the first one to point out, John, people just don't really like you very much. And he was very contemptuous of others. He always believed he knew best. He also thought he should have been elected president first. He didn't think George Washington should be president. John Adams thought he was much more qualified to be president than George Washington. He wanted to be our first president. Instead, he got to be VP. And at the time, VPs were responsible for presiding over the Senate. Technically, they still are, but they don't really do it anymore. But and so his first several years in office, what he did every day was just sit there over the Senate and twiddle his thumbs because you don't really have any power. The senators do the work. He was very disgusted with the whole thing. He always thought he deserved more than he got. XYZ affair is interesting. He almost gets us into a war with France. I'm not going to go into detail on it. Just simply, he sent over 3 people to sort of do negotiations with France. Ended up being like a bribe of France, and he never would identify who they were. So they were known as Mr. X, Mr. Y, Mr. Z. That's why we call it that. And France gets pissed off, and Adams claims that we've been insulted by the French, and the French claim that Adams tried to bribe them, and it was a huge mess, and almost led us into war. Almost. There were hundreds of ships lost on this. Hundreds of ships and hundreds of sailors that were killed or impressed. Impressed is where an enemy actually takes your sailors and basically makes slaves out of them on a ship. Impresses them into labor. He almost puts us in war with France. Would not have been good for us. I mean, our country's barely even getting started, and he's going to send us to war with France. Luckily, France had more things on its mind. It was much more concerned with the revolution and whatnot. Otherwise, France would have taken a greater interest in us, and that would not have been good. Anyway, so you see John Adams wins the North, Federalists, and Democratic Republicans win the South. What's interesting, too, is think about the Three-Fifths Compromise. How would this be different if it wasn't for the Three-Fifths Compromise for slaves in the South? Think about that for a minute. I don't know if it's a discussion question. There may not be enough information there for it, but think about it for a minute. How would this have been different? What would this look like? Would the result would have been the same if what I'm saying was true and there was no Three-Fifths Compromise? The result would be the same. But think about how it actually reflect in the voting. Would the electoral votes have been split like this? No. If you actually take out all the 3/5, all the slave equivalent voting that would not normally count, that would take all these electoral votes down to, I mean, some of these states were 50% black. It would have taken these states down to like 10 votes and like 5 and 6 votes and stuff like that. It would have been, it's just interesting how the Three-Fifths Compromise for those that are non-voting slaves really influences our politics in America in this time period dramatically. Constitutional crisis and the Revolution of 1800. Public criticism of Adams led him passing the Naturalization, Alien, and Sedition Acts. Well, don't get me wrong. Congress passes the laws, but Congress was generally Federalist. So this is what Adams wanted. Congress passes them. He signs them from pressure under the president. Pretty much all these are unconstitutional. Why did he do it? He changed residency requirements for citizenship. To be a citizen and to vote gets changed from 5 to 14 years. Wow, that's a huge change. Because generally immigrants seem to be more leaning of the Democratic Republicans. Because the Federalists are focused on more intellectual more upper class, more whites. And even though immigrants are white, there are a lot of them are immigrant, they're foreign, a lot of them only speak English. So immigrants seem to be leaning more towards the Democratic Republicans. So he actually creates the law and changes citizenship from 5 to 14 years so that the immigrants can't vote. It's crazy how things are so much. I'm sorry, I'm not going to go into modern politics, but I mean, think about things on modern politics with immigration, the things that are happening to disenfranchise immigrants and disenfranchise minority and poor voters. It's been this way since the beginning. John Adams, our second president, tried to do it, tried to disenfranchise people who he thought would vote against him. Alien Act, he also creates their Alien Act, which allows him to deport anyone who's a foreigner. Anyone who makes any breaks any laws, makes any challenges to the government, simply kick them out of the country if they're not a citizen. So we're going to keep making 14 years before they become a citizen, and the Alien Act allows us to kick anyone out who's not a citizen. See how those work together? And then the Sedition Act prohibits anyone publishing or talking about or any type of assaults or verbal attacks on the president or on the government in general. These violate freedom of speech. These violate freedom of due process. It's all created by Adams and the Federalists to try to remain in power against the Democratic Republicans. Yeah, pretty crazy. All this really happens in the 1790s, late 1790s, under Adams' presidency. Lots of debate over these laws, lots of political debate, and the general consensus of newspapers and media and many people is that what we've now got is an oppressive federalist government that looks eerily like England's government. Lots of concerns over this. Lots of debate over this. That many people think the Federalist Party and Congress and the president were seen as creating a government that really was ignoring the Bill of Rights, free speech, and things like this. This destroys the Federalist Party, really, thanks to Adams. It would have maybe gone away anyway, but thanks to Adams' actions and that Congress's actions, it pretty much, it really destroys the Federalists. So in that next election, 1800, Thomas Jefferson goes against John Adams, I believe, again, and Jefferson wins. Lots of irritation with the Federalists and what the Federalists are doing. This is huge. We call this the Revolution of 1800. Think about this. What happened in 1800 when this happened? We have two very significant things. We have a total handover of political power from one faction to another, one political party to another. Peaceful. John Adams gets up, walks out of the White House. He retires gentlemanly. Jefferson walks in. No fighting, no yelling, no screaming, no shooting, no bloodshed. An entirely bloodless revolution. No coups. Just literally, Adams leaves, Jefferson comes in. So we have the Federalists removed from power, and the Democratic Republicans coming in. They also took over Congress. Incredible significant for a brand new fledgling country to have a complete transition of power from two political parties that are ideologically almost opposite of each other, and it's a very calm handover of power. And then the other part of this is, in 1801, when Jefferson takes office, think about the time. That is exactly 25 years after the Revolution. So Jefferson takes office in 1801. The country has now survived 25 years of independence and freedom. We survived a peaceful transition of power. It's really a big deal. It really is. Many countries don't get past this far. Many countries don't make it past the first 25 years, and through their major handoff of power from two ideologically opposite parties, where they simply transition right over quietly and peacefully. It's really huge. It's a big deal. A lot of countries that doesn't work. That leads to civil war and chaos and violence, really commonly. So Jefferson wins here. Aaron Burr, John Adams ran again. The way it worked back then, whoever got 1 and 2 votes, first and second, became president, vice president. So that would mean, I guess, Aaron Burr became vice president. Yeah, that's how it worked back then. It was a little different than now. So the Democratic Republicans had a little more success. little more success in the North. This would have been Federalist territory last time. Now we got some Democratic Republican up there too. Election of 1800. Very interesting. The expanding republic and Native American resistance. So as Americans expanded westward, the care of the Native Americans was really, frankly, the last thing on their mind. Most people didn't care about the Native Americans. They simply saw them as an impediment to westward progress. Disagreements did continue, though, on the West. Lots of disagreements over both land and Indian rights. Lots of disagreements over this. Really, it was all about who owned the land, who controlled the land, owned the land, and who could use the land. Really controversial at the time period. You got to consider Native Americans were there first. Most people don't frankly care about those. At one point, this westward expansion, those lands had been controlled by the French, the Spanish, the British, the Indians, and now the Americans. This is just westward to the Mississippi River, which is only today about a third of our country. So who owns the land? Who claims the land? It's really controversial. Oh, and I got to put in the other factor too. The U.S. being number 5. Well, what about the states? Actually, number 6. Because remember, the states believe they also have a lot of sovereignty. So is it the French, the Indians, the Spanish, the British, the American federal government, the American state governments? Yeah, it's really interesting. So lots of debates about whether that westward land is conquered or legally occupied, who legally occupied it, who conquered it. Yeah, big deal. Officially, on paper, the English government gave that land to us at the end of the war. And they gave the land, though, to the federal government. So even if we want to discount the Spanish, and truthfully, you really can't, because even though the English gave that land to us, the Spanish didn't agree to that. And the Spanish claimed some of that land. What about the French? French claimed some of that land. So the only way that actually works is if everybody respects what the British said, and the French and the Spanish often don't. And bear in mind, none of this considers what the Indians need. No one seems to be concerned about the Native Americans' need or want, or no one seems to care about that. Lots of debate over whether the lands were conquered, whether the Indians were conquered. Who conquered the Indians? Did we conquer them? Was anybody conquer them? Has anyone told the Indians they're conquered? No, most hadn't. There was all kinds of treaties, or actually, it's better I should say lack of treaties, really, in this time period. The treaties come later. At this point in time, there's really no treaties between the Indians and Americans. There's really no treaties. Later, we end up signing hundreds of them, and then we break all of them. They didn't believe they were conquered. They still lived there. So by the 1790s, we find that in most cases, the Native Americans are forced off the land, or they're bribed to leave. Bribery could include weapons, rum, money. Often not what the land is worth at all. Way less than the actual value of the land. But the Indians don't know this. So either by force or bribery or coercion, or sometimes just outright murder, the Native Americans are forced off the land. And generally speaking, the ultimate result of conquered versus legally occupied is the states and the federal government believe they own all of it. It's just a matter of them working out who actually gets it and who gets to make the money off of it, because they started selling all this land. And once they started selling the land, it started generating, well, at one point, westward land sales, and I don't have the exact year, but at one point, westward land sales was the #1 revenue for the U.S. government. So it was worth a lot of money. There's a lot of money to be made out there. Millions and millions of acres. A lot of money. Well, ultimately, what this brings is the settlers into contact with Indians who were unwilling to leave, or they had to force them to leave, or bribe them or coerce them. This led to a lot of fights and attacks, and a lot of people being killed on both sides. For instance, in Ohio, the Ohio Territory, Indian conflict in 1991. You have 3 different groups. You have the settlers, which would represent the state. You have the federal government, which is the U.S. Army, and then you have the Indians. So you have all three groups vying for control of Ohio lands. We have attacks, we have murders, we have killings. We usually see in this time period, it's under George Washington, the U.S. military often losing many times. We didn't have a big military. We had a few thousand soldiers, real like full-time soldiers. Some of these Native American tribes were 10,000 plus. And if they formed a confederation, and which they often did, they could put 10,000 armed soldiers, warriors in the field. And a lot of times they had guns. A lot of times they did. So the U.S. Army was often overmatched until they brought in reinforcements. Washington doubles and triples the military in the West, actually enlists all new soldiers specifically just to deal with Native Americans. We have the Battle of Fallen Timbers. This occurs up in that Ohio Territory. After this conflict ends at the Battle of Fallen Timbers, the treaty is signed, the Greenville Treaty. There are dozens of such conflicts. This is just one example, and it's really indicative of how it goes. The settlers show up. Fighting breaks out between the settlers and Native Americans. The U.S. military or the state military intercedes, then defeats the Indians. Usually dozens or hundreds of people die. Then a treaty is signed. And the treaties pretty much always end up the same way. The Indians lose their land, and the settlers get to take over the land. And the Native Americans get pushed off further westward. That's how it usually happens. In this case, this Battle of Fallen Timbers, this Greenville Treaty, gives almost the entire, what we would call the state of Ohio, at the time would have been territory, almost the entire Ohio Territory is given to the settlers, is given to the government. By 1805, there's over 100,000 Americans in Ohio. It just entirely opens up the floodgates. This happens in lots of other territories. Once the Indians are defeated, the settlers just fill it in. Happens pretty quick. Now, to prevent conflict, the United States government had a plan. It wasn't a very good plan, but they had a plan of assimilation, encouraging the Native Americans to assimilate to the white culture. It was believed if they were to become a farmer, a citizen, and a Christian, that things would be better. There'd be less violence, less problems. They'd be able to assimilate and blend into the society. There are lots of problems with this. Internal divisions among Native Americans was one of the biggest. Native Americans are not a united body. Dozens of tribes with all different goals, all different beliefs, in all different lands. Yeah. Most Native Americans did not want to assimilate. Other issues, female authority was a problem. Among Europeans, women didn't really have authority. Among Indians, women did have high authority. Further, farming. Among Europeans, who did the farming? The men. Well, among Native Americans, the women did the farming because the men did the hunting. Well, now that can't happen. Now they have to change and rearrange their entire culture. A lot of tribes didn't want to. What about being a citizen? Most of them didn't even have any concept of citizenship. That didn't even make any sense to be a citizen. Voting, that doesn't even make any sense. Farmer, most of them were not farmers. Christian, they all already had their own native beliefs, their own native religious beliefs. They saw no reason to change over to this other faith. Their faith had been with them for generations, hundreds, thousands of years. Simply put, most did not want to assimilate and did not assimilate. Just didn't. Yet, the American government said they needed to. The American government said that'll be the best way, because if they assimilate in, then it'll be much easier to take over their land. It's also better for them in a way, the government would say. There'd be less violence against them, less discrimination and prejudice against them. They'll simply become one of many immigrant groups similar to that. Yeah, it doesn't really happen. Most never assimilate. And the violence and the competition, the animosity continues between the Western settlers and Native American tribes. You can see up here the Ohio region, the Battle of Fallen Timbers. You can see the treaty up here, the Greenville Treaty from that region, the Ohio Territory. As we expanded westward to the Mississippi River. So before 1784, all the yellow lands were taken from the Native Americans by Americans or the British. 1784 to 1820, which is the time period we're talking about now, is when all these light green lands were taken. We use the term secessions. That implies that they signed a contract and gave the land over. Technically true. But in fact, most of the time they were coerced, bribed, forced to sign, tricked into signing. Yeah. The implication is these were fair deals and contracts. They were not. Native Americans were taken advantage of every day, 3 times on Sunday. It was bad. They sometimes would have entire regions paid for with cloth and some beads and a case of rum. I mean, it didn't even begin. Most cases they were paid 1,000th, a millionth what the actual value of the land was. But they didn't know any better, or they didn't have a choice. England did it, France did it, Spain did it, we do it. That's the way it is. Doesn't make it right. It's definitely not right. But we got to know, we got to be aware of it. It's not like the land is going to be given back to the Native Americans, but you got to be aware of it. You got to understand that America is really built on blood and violence against Native Americans, against Africans. You just have to understand that. Excellent discussion question. Yes. What in this image indicates assimilation? What is in this image that indicates assimilation to the American way of life, to European style way of life? There are, well, I see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I see 5, 6 things right off the top of my head. What you want to look for is things that would probably not be traditional Native American. Look for things that are different, that might have been introduced by Europeans to where their life was changed. An Indian log house in Georgia, 1791. What in this image indicates assimilation? Further, what in this image indicates non-assimilation? And thirdly, is this overall an assimilated or a non-assimilated group? So you're looking at aspects of assimilation, aspects of non-assimilation, and ultimately, what is your conclusion? Is this an assimilated group or a non-assimilated group? When it's all said and done. Good question. All right, the Western movement, Jeffersonian Revolution. Jefferson's presidency began the Virginia dynasty. The Virginia dynasty, for 24 years, we have 3 straight presidents, each serving 8 years. Jefferson, Madison, Monroe. Goes from 1801 to 1825, technically, because, you know, presidents are elected in the even year, but they don't actually take office till the following spring. So technically, they're elected, the actual proper years of this would be 1801 to 1825, is actually the proper years. Jefferson served 8, Madison served 8, Monroe served 8. All 3 actively supported westward expansion, which was all about land and agriculture, the agrarian vision. It really was the agrarian vision, and this was determined that this would be the most important source of revenue and authority for the U.S. government, and it was. Massive amount of money generated by westward land sales to settlers. They believed in the agrarian vision. Jefferson does other things. He reduces the size of the federal government. He makes it much smaller. Jefferson is a states' rights guy. Jefferson is a 10th Amendment states' rights guy, believing the states actually have most of the authority. The federal government has authority in a few specific categories, but the other 99% of the power is in the hands of the states. And he believed the states should have the power, especially going westward, because westward was pretty much all states. Westward, the states had to take the land. They had to then move settlers out there. Then the settlers have to eventually form their own government for a whole new state. It really seems about, other than the maybe military protection, but again, that only came in occasionally when there was a real crisis with Indians. You were mostly on your own in the West. It was really the Wild West. You were on your own when you were out there. He ended the Alien and Sedition Acts of Adams. Thank goodness he ended those, which were unconstitutional. He got those off the books. He also ends taxes, internal excise taxes, which are sales tax. Altogether, a popular president, focusing on the people, the growth of the farm and the agrarian life, which was where most people were, lower taxes, more power to the states, and of course, lots and lots of open lands for America to expand into. People really liked him. He got reelected. It's popular. In 1803, Marbury versus Madison Supreme Court. This is a Supreme Court ruling, which is incredibly significant in our society. It influences us today. Matter of fact, it influences us dramatically with regard to the Supreme Court. And I talk about it here because it happened under his presidency, and Jefferson did not like it. Jefferson was very unhappy with this. What it does, this says that the Supreme Court justices do not have constitutional power to enforce laws. They can't enforce laws. It becomes quickly determined that is the executive power. Enforcing laws is really the power of the president and his administration, the executive branch. And Supreme Court says they can't do that. But they do have the power to do this. They can review other laws, and they can determine whether they're just or not, or whether they are constitutional or not. This is known as judicial review. So, the Chief Justice was John Marshall at the time. So, while the Supreme Court can't enforce laws, the Supreme Court can tell you what laws you can enforce. The Supreme Court can tell you whether your law is constitutional or not. In other words, whether you can keep your law. So you could pass a law, whether it's a state, federal, local, wherever, and the Supreme Court could then step in and say, you know what, that law doesn't work. It's not constitutional. It is now null and void. Now, the specific decision of Marbury versus Madison, I don't know much detail about it, but I do know the judicial review thing was something that really irritated Jefferson. Because he believed the state should have the authority to do whatever they wanted, practically do whatever they wanted. And the Supreme Court says, no, they don't. No matter what the states do, no matter what their Constitution says, no matter their laws and policies, you know what they cannot do, what none of that can do? Nothing the states do can violate the U.S. Constitution. No matter what, even states have their own constitutions. They all have their own constitutions. Your Constitution is less important than the U.S. Constitution. Your laws are less important than the U.S. laws. And ultimately, the U.S. government can come in and say, in the form of the Supreme Court, and say, your state and local laws are unconstitutional. This basically gave the federal government power to override the states when it came to laws and constitutionality. And Jefferson didn't think that was appropriate. He really thought the buck stopped with the states. Because some states had their own Supreme Courts. I mean, they all do today. Yeah, very interesting. This is probably the most significant. This may even be the leading principle of our United States Constitution. Or, pardon me, our U.S. Supreme Court. Try that again. Yeah. Our Supreme Court, this may be the leading and most important principle of our U.S. It's pretty much all it does now. Supreme Court, pretty much all Supreme Court does is determine whether laws are constitutional or not. This is pretty much their full-time job. It's not in the Constitution that they have the power to do that. He establishes this principle of judicial review, and it becomes the leading principle of the court. Louisiana. Woohoo! Big territory. Jefferson wanted to get it. He wanted to purchase it. Why? To continue westward expansion. For westward expansion of the settlers, and also for a place to actually push the Indians. Because at this time, the Louisiana Territory was, let's see, under Jefferson, it was France. It was under France. It had been under Spain, and Spain had actually traded it back to France. And I say that because years ago it had actually been French. It had been French, then English, then Spanish, then they traded it back to the French. So Jefferson wants to purchase it for westward expansion, also to push the Indians into. He had the Republicans followed him. The Republicans believed him. The Republicans in Congress even dropped the price of land so little. In some places, it's down to $1.25. Now, admittedly, $1.25 today for an acre of land, it's meaningless. It's might as well be free. But even back then, $1.25 wasn't that much money. Anyone could get together $1.25, or $5 or $10 or $20 for land, really. Especially if you're going as a family, you could buy hundreds of acres. Some people did. If you could farm it, take care of it. So land is cheap. Allowing people to move westward, take the land, also allows all the squatters, because there's probably hundreds of thousands of squatters. People just move out there and take the land without paying for it. It also allows the squatters to pay for that land, and it generates a massive source of revenue for the government. Even for the next 30, 40, 50 years, you could get land in the West practically free. Really cheap. Lots of opportunity. So in 1801, this is when Napoleon gets France. It's around the time Napoleon actually starts conquering Europe. But it's around the time Napoleon gets the Louisiana Territory, is what I meant to say. Signs a treaty with Spain. He gets Louisiana Territory for France. Again, he's regaining it because it had been French before. This, now that he has this big amount of territory, which is worth a lot of money, combined with the fact that there was an actual revolt in Haiti, it is the only successful slave revolt in the Western Hemisphere, the Haitian Revolt. It is successful in the 1790s. Overthrows the French government in Haiti and declares independence. The only one. Haiti, Napoleon won it back. Sugar plantations, probably. He also feared losing westward territory because there were already thousands of Americans out there in Louisiana Territory. Thousands of Americans already moved out there, squatting out there on the land. So he worried because he was fighting a war in Europe. He already was losing some lands. So he worries about losing a lot of lands. And so, and again, negotiation is struck up between America and France. Jefferson also begins to fear the effect of France. He fears now that France has lost Haiti, they might try to take it back and send an army over. And if they take Haiti, they might take other lands. Haiti's just right off Florida. They might spread. They also fear that Napoleon, who is conquering Europe, and by the way, in a couple years, he does conquer Europe. What's next? He just conquered Europe. He has what might be the most powerful country in the world. Could he not just pack up 50,000 soldiers or something and move them over here, bring them on over to America, and start colonizing America? He could. So between Napoleon's fears of losing the land and more revolts, and Jefferson's fears about westward expansion and possible French invasion and all this kind of stuff together, negotiations are made. And Napoleon decides it's better to simply get the money. Why? He's fighting a war in Europe. He could really use money, and we offer money. He's given, I don't have it on my slide, I didn't realize I did that. He's given $15 million. We pay $15 million for Louisiana Territory. At the time, it was a fortune. What we did was actually help Napoleon conquer Europe. We actually gave him money to help in his war effort. Now, that wasn't the purpose of it, but we were looking out for ourselves, and we were looking to get the territory, so we gave him millions of dollars, which would have certainly exacerbated the war situation in Europe. Certainly did. Nonetheless, we get it. This allows us to move further westward and also force Indians westward into this territory past the Mississippi River, which is exactly what we do. Then in 1804, Jefferson sends a secretary, Meriwether Lewis, and an army officer, William Clark. sends them to explore the Louisiana Territory. After about a 1,000-mile journey up the Mississippi River, they come into contact with the Mandan Indians, which are Native American farmers. And they also come into contact with the Sioux Indians, who are really militaristic conquerors. The Sioux Indians have actually subjugated other tribes. It's not exactly slavery. It's more of a vassal-lord situation, to where the Sioux are the lords and the other Indian tribes are vassals that have to pay tribute to the Sioux. They have to give them food, treasure. They have to give them horses. They even have to give up women. Stuff like this. It really shows different types of Indians that are out there. There are actually some farmer groups. The reality is, we believe fully that most Native American tribes were not warlike. The amount of evidence we find of war materials and grave goods is very limited. And we also know probably the largest cause of war through most of world history has been resources. Getting resources. Well, there were maybe a couple million Native Americans in North America across the entire continent. There was no limited resources. There was all the resources. The land, the air, the water, the fish, the animals. I mean, there was unlimited resources for the Native Americans. That's probably one of the largest reasons why there was such limited warfare. You simply go the other direction and there's everything you could want and no one has to die. We think most Native Americans were merchants. They were traders. They traded goods. They bartered for goods. They didn't go around killing each other. But some did. The Sioux Indians were aggressive. The Iroquois Indians, we talked about before, they were aggressive. Some were, some weren't. So traveled up Mississippi River, other rivers. He goes up and goes all the way to Canada. Columbia River, makes it all the way to the Pacific Ocean, all the way to the ocean. Lewis and Clark do. Another 1,300 miles. Ultimately, over 4,500 miles round trip. Pretty crazy, really. Canada, Pacific Coast, they go over the Rocky Mountains. They come back with all these maps, all these charts. Significant. Because all these maps and charts of the Western North America. All these charts and maps, and all of it lists resources, it lists the inhabitants, it lists different tribes, it lists all the kinds of things they saw that they thought would be useful and important for an expanding country. It prompts many people to envision the idea that we actually could go coast to coast. No one had even talked about that. No one even envisioned. I mean, do you realize the U.S. across east to west is almost as big as Europe? And the idea of something that size in the hands of one country? A dozen European countries could fit in the United States. And this idea that you could do that was, well, frankly, no one had really even imagined it. Until Lewis and Clark can say, yeah, us just by ourselves, the two of us and our guides, made it all the way there and back again. In one piece, which is actually amazing. At one point, they were lost on one of these rivers, the Missouri River, I think, for weeks. Just floating in the river, lost. And then, boom, they run back into their group. That was a freaking miracle. Truthfully, they should have died. Anyway, if it was so easy for them to do it and get back, and they charted all this land, and they meet these Native American tribes, most of them very peaceful, willing to trade and negotiate. They didn't just kill Lewis and Clark. It really makes people start to think, wow, we could actually do this. In just a few years, we went from the green area over here to already colonize. I mean, when I say Ohio, in 10 years, 100,000 people went in Ohio. In just 10 years. So it isn't that big of a stretch to say, oh my gosh, imagine another 20, 30, 40 years. I mean, if we could fill up Ohio in less than a decade, imagine how long would it really take us to fill up all this? At the rate we're going, not very long, truthfully. A couple generations, we could go all the way to the coast, maybe. Some people actually start thinking that's possible, this idea of coast-to-coast country. Really, lots of expansionist ideas come out of what Lewis and Clark did. And the fact that we opened up another third of our country. We pretty much double the size of the United States with this Louisiana Purchase, the big pink thing here in the middle. We double the size of the U.S., which is, again, what becomes the United States. It adds like a whole other third of our country to us. Really changes a lot of things. Really does. So we're going to look at the War of 1812, transformation of politics. Well, the Napoleonic Wars in Europe and in the Atlantic, again, we didn't call it a world war, but it was sort of a world war. It was really sort of the first world war, really. I take that back. The 7 Years' War was actually really the first world war. Nonetheless, Napoleonic Wars in Europe and the Atlantic eventually brings us into it. We actually get involved in the war, not because we want to, but we're brought into it by force. By 1802, we saw the French and the British seizing our ships and impressing our sailors. That's what it's called. They would seize our ships, take our goods, because each one of them, because France and England were at war with each other, each one of them would see American ships and think the ships were trading with the other one, which sometimes they were. I mean, we have always been war profiteers. Since the very beginning, our country has war profited off of every conflict we could. It has been sort of a way of life for American industry. Profiteering off of the wars around the world. We've always done it. This is no different. So we were doing war profiteering. We were selling stuff to the French. We were selling stuff to the English. We were selling stuff to other countries. Pretty much anyone who would buy it. It was a free market economy. Capitalism. That's what it was. But that's also Jefferson's vision. Jefferson's agrarian vision required us to sell all these agricultural goods. So we were. And it was certainly boosting America's economy. Well, we started losing a lot of ships by the early 1800s because both the French and the British were taking our ships, impressing our sailors. We lost thousands of sailors that were basically taken and made slave sailors aboard French and British ships. Happened a lot. Well, in 1807, we get the Embargo Act. And the idea of the Embargo Act was passed by Congress. It was to actually keep our ships from going out into the ocean, to keep our people from being captured by the British and the French, and to lose our ships. Because when you lose the ships, too, these ships are a huge value, huge investment of value. Plus, on top of that, you lose all the cargo. For some people, that cargo would be their entire life's work, or years of work in some cases. A fortune, all gone. So you lose all the cargo, you lose the men, you lose the ships. I mean, so the U.S. government actually steps in and says, stop it. Actually, we're going to stop the shipping. We're going to force the states to stop shipping until the French and the British stop taking our ships. American economy was greatly weakened, even to the point of trade dropping like 80%. 80% of trade. I mean, our economy almost came to a stop as a result of the wars in France and the wars spilling outside the borders. It's crazy. In 1808, Madison's elected president. He's the second in the Virginia dynasty. The second. He's elected. He continues to restrict American trade, believing it has to be. There's further concerns here. Not only are we losing ships and soldiers and all of our goods, there's another concern. What might that be? War. There's actual concern that might actually lead us to war with France. Or England. Either one. Which we did not want. We just barely, a generation earlier, managed to survive a war with England, only with the help of France. Now we could actually find ourselves in a potential war footing with both France and England. We didn't want any part of that. So Madison continues to restrict the economy, continues to restrict shipping. This, honestly, was actually probably worse than just the ships that were lost. Truthfully. The fact that we'd lose 1 out of 5 or 1 out of 10 ships or something, and a handful of Americans would actually get impressed. It isn't like they were murdered. They were simply forced to work on the British or the French ships. Ultimately, probably did a lot more damage to our economy. Had he just let it go, and we would have lost a ship here, lost a ship there, lost a few sailors, lost some cargo here, the economy would have probably done much better. However, it would have not protected American lives. And also, the continued stress and tension of having all those ships being taken was what he thought might actually lead to war, which is actually logical. What he was doing, he thought was the best for everybody. Don't know if it was or not, but certainly had those interesting effects. The Republicans in the West blamed England for all of this. They blamed England for all these troubles. They couldn't blame themselves after all. It's not our fault because we want to keep trading goods across the ocean to France, and the British keep taking our ships. After all, we need to make a profit, right? It's about money. So it was challenging. In 1809, we actually have a war chief, Tecumseh, 1809, a Shawnee war chief. He built a confederacy of Indian tribes, and he mobilizes his people to resist the white man. This is part of that resisting on Indian lands after the whole Louisiana Purchase. It's one of those confederations I talked about. Tecumseh gathering together all these Indian soldiers to stop the white man's advance. Just to do this. Violence breaks out between the natives, the whites. We see lots of killing and murdering. Well, England actually was involved in this. England was actually paying the Indians to attack us. Because England still had a heavy investment in America because of Canada. So all of North America, the north part of it, was actually British. So all that was Canada. So England actually wanted to slow our growth in America, slow our expansion, and they wanted to get some of those lands. They didn't want us going coast to coast. They wanted to come down and actually block us. They couldn't do anything about the French territory, but they could rile up the Indians, get the Indians coming after us. And they do this. They bribe the Native Americans, they pay off Native Americans, they make alliances with Native Americans to get the Indians to attack us without the British getting involved. Very interesting. Madison asked for a declaration of war in 1812. He comes to fully believe that all of this is the machinations of the English. The English are doing all this. They're taking our ships. They're forcing Indians against us. They're actually trying to stop our westward expansion, which is like the most important goal of the government, doing all this stuff. And so he really believes the British are at fault for all this. And they're trying to stop America from being, great or expansive. So he does ask Congress for a declaration of war, and we do declare war against England in 1812, arguing that England had violated our commercial rights and they were inciting Indians against us. Now, to go back to Tecumseh for just a moment. Tecumseh, it was ugly. Hundreds of people die before the Americans finally put down the revolution, or the revolution might be the right, uprising is the right word maybe, against Tecumseh. We declare war on England. However, we do it, at least according to Madison, believing that they've actually declared war on us already. They came first. They're taking our ships, killing our soldiers, killing our settlers. They're wanting to take the land from us in the West. They're contesting all the land in the West. Not Louisiana Territory, but everything west of that. Everything past Louisiana Territory, up in we think of Washington, Oregon area. They're contesting they're saying all that land's actually theirs. And the U.S. government is starting to say, well, I think we'd like that land. We declare war. We got lucky in this war, really. This could have gone badly. England was still a great power. This was probably not a wise choice on Madison's part, because we almost lost this. And there's actually a lot of bad things that happened, and we really almost lost this conflict. It could have gone much worse. This was a mistake, and we call these war hawks. These are people that are really just, they want to fight. They always want to fight. You ever know anyone like that? Some friend, some cousin, that every time there's any situation, they just want to fight. They don't want to compromise. They don't want to discuss. They don't want to debate. They just want to be aggressive and attack. That's your war hawks. They would fight, even if it isn't in their best interest, they'll do it anyway. They don't care. This was a big failure politically and militarily. This was a big mistake, doing this. Anyway, first of all, we tried to invade Canada. What? Yeah, we fail. We failed that. We lose battles, invasion of Canada. We try to invade Eastern Canada. It's a joke. We don't do well at all. We do eventually defeat Tecumseh. We do eventually defeat some British forces in the West. We defeat some British soldiers in the West and some Native American tribes. In the East, though, we didn't do very well. The East, there was a lot of resistance to the war. Many people thought this was a mistake because we'd barely beat England before, And many people thought this was crazy to go against England again, just 30 years, 30 some years ago, and now you want to do it again. England controlled the seas. By 1813, England controlled pretty much the east. They controlled the seas. They were invading the northern colonies. They burned Washington to the ground. England's coming at us from every direction. They're coming at us from Canada in the north. They're trying to take territories there. They're coming at it from the ocean, from the water. They're invading up through the Mississippi River Valley. Uh, we really opened up a can of worms with this, going to war with England right here. They control the ships. They're taking the seas. They control American ships. They burn Washington. Now, one of the things that actually stops this, one of the things that really brings this to an end, is Andrew Jackson. The war goes on for several years, and England doesn't really gain anything. England has very weak power in Canada. England is busy fighting Napoleon in Europe because Napoleon it's all wrapping up with Napoleon, but still England has been very drawn out. England was one of the #1 defenders against Napoleon, trying to stop Napoleon's aggressions. So England is highly expended against Napoleon. And Napoleon's shipping as well. Napoleon had a navy, and they lost lots of ships as well. They don't have a big presence in Canada. Then they lead this invasion up through the Mississippi River area, and Andrew Jackson stops them. The Battle of New Orleans, maybe it's called the Battle of New Orleans, Battle of Louisiana. Anyway, he stops the British Army and defeats the British Army, stopping the invasion of the Mississippi River area. Which, if they managed to actually invade and take over Mississippi River, they would have cut the U.S. off, maybe stopped us completely from our own Louisiana Territory that we purchased. Now, would that have lasted long term? Probably not. But it still would have made a big statement if they were able to take over parts of North America and we couldn't stop them. It was really, really challenging. We had lots of militiamen. We didn't have a big military. Jackson was a general over Tennessee, I think, and he brought his own militia down with him. It was his own private army. They proclaim him general at some point. His own private military. Eventually, he wins. This cost the U.S. $88 million. Hugely expensive. Took us years to pay it off. Hugely expensive. It dramatically increased the national debt, which was almost nothing before this. Now, when Napoleon was defeated in 1815, England had large amount of forces. England could have actually launched a full-scale invasion of America, maybe. With Napoleon down, the French defeated, England had opportunity here to potentially conquer much of North America. Maybe. Jackson is the one that does stop him with that invasion. And he rallies the nation behind behind the Republican government. And England actually calls for peace. England actually calls for peace after Jackson wins the victory. He may have single-handedly saved part of North America from the English. England had been drained they had actually been in war with France now for almost 20 years. There was 2 French revolutions and Napoleon actually had 2 different wars. Napoleon actually was 2 different times. So anyway, England was ready to be done with this. They asked for a treaty. The Treaty of Ghent is signed. And after all this war, pretty much puts everything back where it was in the first place. All the borders put back. Peace again. Everything generally just goes back to normal. It's very anticlimactic. Thousands die. Washington's burned. Dozens of cities are destroyed up in the northeast, around Washington and Maryland, down around New Orleans. It's ugly. It's messy. Yet, when it was said and done and over, nothing changed. No land really changed hands. No territory changed hands, other than another interesting fact. We beat the British again. Again, a country that was much more powerful than us, had a lot more money, like 10 times more soldiers or more, 100 times more soldiers, a massive navy, and yet we defeated them a second time. And we also pretty much guarantee our right to westward expansion across the continent now. That doesn't mean the British give up everything. They still generally try to contest the Seattle or the Washington Territory, Northwest Territory. They try to sort of contest that Washington, Oregon area. But other than that, generally speaking, we have open door to expand all the way across the continent. Well, okay, the Spanish are out there. How many years before the Spanish are gone? When does Mexico declare independence? 1821. So the Spanish thing pretty much takes care of itself. It resolves itself. Mexico declares independence and they kick Spain out. Fortunately, it doesn't work out well for them in the long run. Nothing to really take from this image. Just gives you an idea what America looks like at the time. You see Jackson's actions down here. He may have single-handedly saved the West. Probably one of the things that helps him get elected president here in 15 years. Certainly. But interesting. This was one of the big complaints made. We believed the reason we went to war, the British were taking our ships, taking our men, taking our goods, and they were inciting the Indians to attack us. So this is anti-British propaganda, showing the British are fat, slovenly, lazy. The Indians are working for them by scalping American soldiers, literally cutting the heads off, cutting the hair and the scalps off of Americans and paying them. And it says up here at the top, the humane British and their worthy allies, the Indians. Obviously dripping with satire or sarcasm there. They mean exactly opposite of that, of course. That the British are unworthy and the Indians are unworthy, scalping and killing. And then I like how it says on the back of the gun here, but you may have a hard time to see, reward for 16 scalps. Stating that if you kill 16 Americans and you scalp them, the British will give you a gun. One gun, apparently. I have no idea if there's any truth to that, but the propaganda on this is very clear. The British are murderers, killers. They're inciting other people to kill our soldiers and kill our people and take our lands. And the Indians are savages. The British are savages. They're lazy. Anyway, it's incredibly insulting to both Indians and British. The British part is actually pretty accurate. The British were paying the Indians to attack the Americans. They were paying them. They were bribing them. They were coercing them. They were promising lands. They were giving them weapons. The British were doing all this. That is actually true. The British thought it was an effective tactic because they didn't want to go to war with us directly. They didn't. And they thought using the Indians as sort of a proxy to attack and injure the Americans would be good. And it was good for them. It was a smart tactic, really. It led to war, but did the British lose anything in this war? Not really. The British didn't lose anything. Not really. We were the winners. We gained the right to further expansion. We stopped the British a second time in 2 generations. No one had ever done that. We were 2-0 against the British. There was like no countries that were 2-0 against the British. Incredibly lucky. Really. We could have very easily lost this war. Could have very easily lost the Revolutionary War. Maybe one of the reasons some people thought we were destined. As we'll talk about soon in the next chapter, Manifest Destiny. We were destined to move westward. God had chosen us to expand westward. Look what we did with the British. We beat them 2 times in a row. The greatest empire in the world. Kicked their butt twice. God had to be on our side. All right. Next one. This will end the chapter. All right. The legacy of the end of the war. The Federalists are now pretty much gone away. The Federalists resisted and actually challenged the war. They didn't believe in the war. We have these two factions. We have these Republicans. We have the Federalists. The Republicans actually split into 2 parties. The Republicans split into the National Republicans and Jeffersonian Republicans. And the Federalists disappear. The Federalists are gone now, and they generally seem to blend into the National Republicans, which should make a lot of sense. Federalists are really about a strong national federal government. National Republicans, national government. Jeffersonian Republicans are still pretty much focused on the states and the agrarian vision. Small government, limited taxes, because of course the southern states is all about trade, so they don't want taxes. So limited taxes, limited government interference, state rights, and basically the government just needs to stay out of our business as much as possible. And then you have the National Republicans, which lean more towards this idea of we have to have an economy, a good, successful merchant trade economy, but we also have all the cities to deal with and all the industry art because we're now in the Industrial Revolution, the first one. So we have all that to deal with. We have all the industry, the cities, I mean, between the Northeast, all the cities have a couple million people. You go from Chicago over to New York, several million people in cities. So that's important. Um, Very interesting. Generally, the North is these national Republicans, and the Jeffersonians are generally the West and the South. Pretty easy to say. More urban areas are more likely to be national, more rural areas are more likely to be Jeffersonian. So talk about Madison. Now, the last president in the Virginia dynasty is Monroe. I'm not going to talk much about Monroe because there's not a lot to say. Monroe is actually a very successful president. We actually give the name to his time in office, the era of good feelings. We really repair our relations with England and France and Spain. Spain, we still have a bit of an issue over Florida. But generally speaking, we repair our relations with these very powerful world powers. We start having all kinds of trade rights. And from this moment on, we are pretty much on friendly or sort of friendly terms with European powers in general. Generally speaking. The Monroe Doctrine is issued, and this is something which is interesting, which might or might not have had an impact upon this. The Monroe Doctrine says, pretty simple, that the European powers are to stay out of the West, the Western Hemisphere, to stay out of the Americas. It in essence says the Americas are off limits to Europeans. Stay away. No more colonization, no more settlement over here. You need to go away. The West is closed for business, meaning the Americas. Closed for business. Stay in your side of the world, leave our side of the world alone. We don't want to interfere in European affairs. We don't want to get involved in European wars. We don't want you coming over here and inciting wars over here, like the British just did with the Indians. We don't want you causing wars over here either. Stay on your side of the water, we'll stay on our side. And we're all good. Now, Europeans don't exactly do this. Not really. A little bit, but not really. It's only sort of. But ultimately, we grow and expand and become more successful. More tranquil times in America. Political relations also are really good between two political parties. We actually see the two political parties get along generally because they actually agree on more than they disagree on. They agree on westward expansion. They agree on immigration. They agree on making money off of the Western lands. And they also agree that we want to stay out of issues of the Europeans. We want to leave the Europeans alone, and we want them to leave us alone. They generally agree on those things too. Era of good feelings. Good feelings internationally between us and other European countries. I mean, nothing's perfect, of course, but I'm saying in general. And good feelings within America between our two political factions. Which is great because this is about the last damn time. It's about the last time our political parties really seem to get along on anything. And of course, I'm exaggerating a little there, but not that much, really. I mean, look how political factionism today, partisanship is today in Washington. It's practically. What do you call that when you're a traffic jam? It's practically a traffic jam in Washington. Almost nothing gets done. At least it seems that way, right? I mean, none of us are sitting up there. I don't know how many laws they pass, but it just seems like nothing's getting done. All they can do is argue and basically point fingers at each other all the time. It's not really good for everybody. Anyway, and so the final thing you look at, here's the map. You can see where we were at the time of the Revolution, where we were in 1803. You can see disputed territory here. Disputed territory, Maine and Oregon. Disputed territory between the British and the Americans primarily. You can see territory we got from Spain. Mexico declares independence down here. Eventually, we get control of Florida, finally, of 1819. Takes almost a decade. We get it piece by piece by piece. So by 1820, which is when this chapter ends, we have taken everything, including everything down here. We include everything up to this line. All of this is now America. About 70% of what becomes the United States is already established as of 1820. which is really just the very first generations, the first 2 generations of the United States. 30 years. That's not even 2 generations, that's a generation and a half. We'd already pretty well established what was going to become most of the United States. And most of this was empty of settlers. Lots of Native Americans out there. But the settlers didn't care. Neither did our government, really. All right. Thank you very much for going through it, and we will see you next time.